The sky over the Moretti estate did not just rain. It mourned in a violent, rhythmic thrashing of water against stone. At precisely 2:14 a.m., the heavy iron gates of the mansion groaned, their gears grinding against the howling wind as the black Maybach armored sedan approached. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with the metallic scent of copper and the sterile aroma of expensive leather. Dante Moretti, known to the world as the Shadow King, leaned his head back against the headrest, his eyes closed. His knuckles were bruised, and a thin, drying streak of someone else's blood marred the cuff of his bespoke charcoal suit. It had been a long night of enforcing loyalty in the dark corners of the city, a night that required the kind of cold-blooded efficiency that had made him the most feared CEO in Mafia in Ketchy State area. He wanted nothing more than a glass of neat scotch and the silence of his empty, echoing halls. But as the car's headlights swept across the perimeter, the driver suddenly slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. Dante's eyes snapped open, obsidian and lethal. "Why are we stopping, Lorenzo?" he rasped, his voice a low vibration of untapped menace. Lorenzo, a man who had seen 1,000 horrors and never blinked, was staring through the windshield, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Sir, there's something at the gate. Or someone." Dante leaned forward, his gaze piercing the curtain of torrential rain. At first, he saw nothing but the flickering shadows of the ancient oaks. Then, as the lightning fractured the sky in a jagged flash of white, he saw her. A small, hunched figure was huddled against the cold iron bars, so tiny she looked like a discarded bundle of rags. She was sitting on the freezing concrete, her knees tucked into her chest, shivering so violently that even from the distance of the car, Dante could see the tremors racking her frame. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Her hair, a tangled mess of dark curls, clung to her pale face, and she was soaked to the bone. "Get out," Dante commanded, his voice devoid of warmth but sharp with curiosity. He didn't wait for his security detail to move. He pushed the heavy door open himself, stepping out into the storm. The rain instantly drenched his hair, plastering his shirt to his broad shoulders, but he didn't feel the cold. He walked toward the gate with the predatory grace of a wolf, his eyes locked on the intruder. As he approached, the little girl looked up. Dante froze. The breath left his lungs as if he had been struck in the solar plexus. Her eyes, they were large, almond-shaped, and a deep, piercing gray were a haunting mirror of his own. They were the Moretti eyes, a genetic stamp that had been passed down through generations of ruthless men. But it wasn't just the eyes. It was the defiant set of her jaw, the way she didn't scream or cower as the most dangerous man in the country loomed over her. Dante demanded, his tone unintentionally harsh as he tried to mask the sudden, inexplicable thrumming of his heart. The girl didn't answer. Her teeth were chattering so loudly they made a clicking sound. She looked down at what she was holding, her small arms wrapped tightly around a tattered, one-eyed teddy bear. The toy was gray with age and filth, and as the light from the mansion's security lamps hit it, Dante noticed a dark, brownish-red stain blooming across its plush stomach. It wasn't mud, it was blood, dried and stiff. "Where's your mother?" Dante asked, his voice dropping an octave. The girl finally spoke, her voice a tiny, fragile thread that barely rose above the roar of the thunder. Mama said to wait for the lion. She said the lion would keep the bad men away." She looked up at him then, her gaze dropping to his hand. Dante followed her eyes. He was wearing the Moretti signet ring, a heavy gold band engraved with a roaring lion's head. The girl reached into the collar of her oversized, waterlogged sweater and pulled out a thin chain. Hanging from it was a gold locket, scratched and dull, but instantly recognizable. Dante felt the world tilt on its axis. He reached out, his large, scarred hand trembling slightly as he took the locket from her tiny, frozen fingers. He clicked the latch, the hinge protesting with a faint snap. Inside, protected from the rain by a plastic seal, was a photograph. It wasn't a recent photo. It was a picture of a teenage Dante, standing in the mansion's garden, looking uncharacteristically relaxed. A rare, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. There was only one person in the world who possessed that photo. Only one person he had ever allowed to see that version of him. "Alina," he whispered, the name tasting like ash and old. buried longing on his tongue. Elena Vance, the girl who had been a maid in this house 6 years ago. The girl who had been his only weakness, the only light in his dark, violent world, before she had supposedly stolen a fortune from his father's safe and vanished into the night without a word. He had spent years hating her, years convincing himself that her touch had been a lie and her whispers of love had been a distraction. He looked back at the girl, really looking at her this time. The curve of her nose, the shape of her lips, she was the perfect, terrifying blend of him and the woman he had tried so hard to forget. "What is your name, child?" Dante asked, his voice cracking. The girl hugged her blood-stained bear tighter, her eyes filling with tears that were instantly washed away by the rain. "I'm Lily," she sobbed, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion and terror. "Mama told me to run. She told me to find the gate and never look back." There was so much red. Mr. Lion, Mama wouldn't get up. A surge of cold, calculated fury erupted in Dante's chest, hotter than any anger he had felt during the night's earlier business. He looked at the blood on the teddy bear and realized it wasn't the child's. It was a map of a struggle, a mother's final sacrifice to get her daughter to the only sanctuary she knew. Dante didn't think. He didn't consult his advisors or consider the political implications of a child appearing at his doorstep. He reached down and scooped the girl up into his arms. She was dangerously light, her skin like ice against his heated chest. She tucked her head into the crook of his neck, her small hands clutching the lapels of his expensive suit, staining the silk with the grime of the streets and the blood of her mother. "Lorenzo, open the house," called Dr. Harris immediately. Dante roared over the wind. He turned and strode back toward the mansion, his silhouette framed by the lightning, carrying the secret he never knew he had. As he crossed the threshold, the warmth of the foyer hitting them, Lily's grip loosened, and her eyes drifted shut, her strength finally failing. But as she went limp in his arms, the teddy bear fell to the floor, and the seams of the toy, already strained, burst open. Dante stopped in his tracks, looking down. It wasn't just cotton stuffing spilling out onto his pristine marble floors. Tucked deep inside the bear's belly was a thick, plastic-wrapped bundle of papers, a decrypted ledger. The pages covered in the coded language of the underworld, listing names and dates that could topple his entire empire. Dante stared at the ledger, then at the sleeping girl in his arms, realizing that the storm outside was nothing compared to the war that had just arrived at his front door. He looked at the locket still clutched in his hand, and knew one thing for certain. His past wasn't just coming back to haunt him, it was coming to burn everything he had built to the ground. The heavy oak doors of the Moretti Manor slammed shut against the howling gale, cutting off the roar of the storm, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. Dante stood in the center of the grand foyer, his chest heaving, his tailored suit ruined by mud and rainwater. In his arms, the small, limp weight of the girl felt like an anchor, dragging him down into a past he had spent 4 years trying to bury. Beneath his feet, the contents of the tattered teddy bear lay scattered across the white Carrara marble like a grisly offering. Lorenzo, Dante's head of security, and a man who had witnessed massacres without blinking, stood frozen by the staircase. His gaze flickered from the unconscious child to the plastic-wrapped bundle of papers spilling out of the plush toy's burst abdomen. He recognized the ciphers instantly. Every man in the Moretti syndicate knew of the black ledger, the missing record of every offshore account, every bribed official, and every double agent within their ranks. It was the holy grail of the underworld, and it had just fallen out of a child's toy. "Don Dante," Lorenzo whispered, his voice cracking with a rare tremor. Is that the Vance ledger?" Dante didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the girl's face, up close, under the harsh glow of the crystal chandeliers. The resemblance was undeniable. She had the same high cheekbones as Elena, the same stubborn set to her jaw, but the shape of her eyes, even closed in a feverish sleep, was a mirror image of the man holding her. Dante felt a strange, terrifying constriction in his throat. He looked down at the ledger, then at the dark, drying stains on the teddy bear's fur. The copper scent of blood reached his nostrils, sharp and unmistakable. It was too much blood for a child who didn't appear to have any visible wounds. "Get the doctor here now," Dante roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. and get this ledger into the vault. If a single soul outside this room hears about this, I will have your head on a spike, Lorenzo. You understand?" Lorenzo scrambled to gather the papers, his movements frantic. Dante didn't wait. He turned and carried the girl up the sweeping staircase, his strides long and predatory. He didn't take her to a guest room. He took her to his own private wing, a place where no one, not even his closest advisors, was permitted to enter. He laid her down on the charcoal gray silk sheets of his massive bed. She looked impossibly small in the middle of his cold, masculine world, a speck of fragile light in a room built for a shadow. Minutes later, Dr. Harris, the syndicate's private physician, rushed in, still buttoning his shirt. He took one look at the girl and the blood on Dante's hands and paled. "Is she shot, sir? Just check her," Dante commanded, stepping back but refusing to leave the room. He stood by the window, watching the lightning strike the distant hills, his hands trembling a weakness he hadn't allowed himself since he was a boy. He listened to the rhythmic sounds of the doctor's examination, the snip of scissors as her wet clothes were removed, the hiss of antiseptic, the steady beep of a portable monitor. "The blood isn't hers, Don Dante," Harris finally said, his voice cautious. Dante turned, his eyes narrowing. "Explain." Harris pointed to the girl's small shoulder, where a faint bruise was forming, but the skin was unbroken. "She's exhausted, dehydrated, and suffering from mild hypothermia, but she isn't bleeding. This blood, it's fresh, perhaps only an hour or two old. Given the volume on her clothes and that toy, whoever was holding her was severely injured. They were likely shielding her." Dante's mind flashed to Alina. He pictured her in the rain, bleeding out while she pushed this child toward his gate. The thought sent a jolt of visceral pain through him, followed by a tidal wave of fury. Who had touched her? Who had dared to hunt the only woman he had ever loved? Suddenly, the girl stirred. A soft, pained whimper broke the silence of the room. Dante was at the bedside, in an instant, his shadow looming over her. Her eyelashes fluttered. And then she opened them wide, soulful pools of amber that stared directly into his soul. For a moment, she looked terrified, her small frame shaking under the heavy blankets. But then, her gaze drifted down to his hand, which was resting on the edge of the mattress. Her eyes fixed on the heavy gold signet ring on his finger, the Morty lion, its ruby eyes glinting in the lamplight. A small, shaky hand reached out from under the covers, her fingers hovering just inches from the ring. "The man with the lion," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Dante froze, his breath hitching in his chest. "What did you say, little one?" Lily looked up at him, her lip trembling, but she didn't pull away. "Mama said, if the shadows come to take the light, I have to find the man with the lion ring. She said you are the king of the shadows. She said you would keep me safe because I am your heart." But the air in the room seemed to vanish. Dante felt as though he had been struck in the chest with a sledgehammer. "So because I am your heart." So those were the last words Elena had whispered to him the night she vanished. The night he had accused her of being a spy and a thief. He had spent years believing she had betrayed him for money. But as he looked at the ledger sitting on his nightstand, a ledger that contained the names of his enemies and the child who bore his face, the truth began to unravel his reality. Elena hadn't stolen from him. She had stolen him. She had taken the evidence of a coup and disappeared to protect the life growing inside her. She had lived in the shadows for 5 years, running from the very monsters Dante commanded. All to keep this little girl alive. "Where is your mother, Lily?" Dante asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched the edge of the blanket. "The bad men. They had loud sticks. Mama told me to run through the hole in the fence. She said don't look back, no matter what. She stayed to fight the monsters." She began to sob then, a heartbroken, primal sound that tore through Dante's icy exterior. He did something then that he hadn't done in a lifetime. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the weeping child into his lap, wrapping his massive arms around her. "Shh," he murmured, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. "The monsters can't reach you here. I am the king of the shadows, remember? And no one touches what belongs to the king." As he held her, he looked over her head at Lorenzo, who was standing in the doorway, looking pale. "Lorenzo," Dante said, his voice deathly quiet, the coldness of the Shadow King returning with a vengeance. Assemble the elite units. Scour every inch of the woods within a 10-mile radius of the gate. Find her. If she's breathing, bring her home. If she's not. He paused, his grip on Lily tightening slightly. Then find whoever did this and bring them to me alive. I want them to pray for death before the sun rises. Lorenzo nodded and vanished into the hall. Dante looked down at the girl, who had cried herself back into an exhausted sleep in his arms. He reached out and touched the gold locket he had taken from her earlier, clicking it open once more. He stared at the photo of his younger self, a boy who hadn't yet been corrupted by the crown. He realized then that the ledger wasn't the most dangerous thing the girl had brought him. It was the truth. And as he looked at the bloodstains on his sleeves, he knew that a war was coming, a war not for territory or power, but for the family he never knew he had. But just as he began to lay Lily back down, his phone vibrated on the bedside table. It was an encrypted message from an unknown number. He swiped the screen, and his heart stopped. It was a photo, blurred and dark, showing a woman tied to a chair in a dimly lit warehouse, her face covered in bruises but her eyes still burning with defiance. Below the image was a single sentence. Sal, we have the mother. You have the book. Let's trade, Shadow King. Sal. The glow of the smartphone screen was the only light in the darkened room, casting a ghoulish blue wave over Dante's sharp features. He stared at the image of Alina, the woman who had haunted his dreams and fueled his rage for half a decade, until his eyes burned. She looked fragile, her skin pale and marred by dark bruises, but her eyes were wide, screaming a silent plea not for her own life, but for the safety of the child currently sleeping just inches away from him. The trade was simple, the ledger for the mother. Bang. But Dante Moretti didn't play by anyone's rules, and he certainly didn't negotiate with those who dared to bleed his people. He stood up, his long, charcoal coat swaying like a shadow as he moved toward the window. Outside, the thunderstorm was beginning to lose its fury, settling into a rhythmic, mournful drizzle. He looked down at his hands that had built an empire and crushed bones with equal indifference. For the first time in his 32 years, they were shaking. He clenched them into fists, the leather of his gloves creaking in the silence. A soft moan came from the bed. Dante turned, his gaze softening in a way that would have terrified his enemies. Lily was shifting under the heavy down comforter, her small face pinched in a mask of childhood trauma. He walked back to the bedside, his footsteps silent on the plush Persian rug. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the weight of his body causing the springs to groan. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before brushing a stray damp lock of hair from the girl's forehead. She looked so much like him it was an ache in his chest. The high cheekbones, the slight cleft in her chin, even the way her eyebrows knit together in a stubborn line while she slept, it was the Morty brand, unmistakable and eternal. This wasn't just a girl Alina had brought into the world. This was his blood, his legacy, and he had almost turned her away at the gate. Sharp knock at the door broke the silence. Dante didn't move. Enter, he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. Silas, the Morty family's senior advisor, and a man who had served Dante's father before him, stepped into the room. He looked at the child, then at the ledger sitting on the nightstand, and finally Dante. His expression was one of cold, pragmatic concern. The board is calling for an emergency session, Dante. The Romanos are already moving on the northern docks. They know the ledger is here. They know about the girl. Every second she stays in this house, the target on your back grows larger. We need to move her to a secure facility or hand her over to the state. She is a liability we cannot afford. Dante's head snapped toward Silas, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. A liability, he repeated, the words dripping with ice. You are speaking about my daughter, Silas. Choose your next words with extreme care. Silas paled, his posture stiffening. We don't know that for certain, sir. Alina Vance was a maid. She disappeared under suspicious circumstances. This could be a long con, a plant by the Romanos to get a Trojan horse inside these walls. The DNA hasn't been verified. I don't need a piece of paper to tell me what my own soul already knows, Dante growled. He stood up, towering over the older man. Cancel the board meeting. Cancel the merger talks with the Parisians. Cancel everything. My schedule is clear, until I say otherwise. But the revenue loss alone, I don't give a damn about the revenue. Dante's voice rose, a rare crack in his composure. He caught himself, glancing back at Lily to ensure she hadn't woken up. When he looked back at Silas, his gaze was lethal. I am the king of the shadows, Silas. I have enough money to buy and sell the Romanos 10 times over. What I don't have is the time I lost with her. You will bring Dr. Eris here immediately. Tell him to bring a mobile paternity kit. If he tells a soul, he won't live to see the sunrise. And Silas, if any of the advisors suggest disposing of my child again, they will be meeting my father in hell by morning. Am I clear? Silas bowed his head, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The ruthless CEO was still there, but he was being overtaken by something far more dangerous, a father with a grudge. Perfectly clear, sir. I will summon the doctor. As Silas retreated, Dante turned his attention back to the ledger. He picked it up, flipping through the pages of encrypted code and names. It was a death warrant for half the underworld. Alina had been incredibly brave or incredibly desperate to steal this. She had been protecting him, even while he was cursing her name for 5 years. He realized now that his father's proof of her betrayal had been a lie, a fabricated story to keep the Morty bloodline from being tainted by a commoner. He sat there for hours, a silent sentinel in the dark. He watched the way Lily's chest rose and fell. He watched the shadows dance on the walls. He was learning her. Every few minutes, she would whimper, and he would instinctively reach out, his large hand resting near her shoulder until she settled. It was the first act of mercy he had shown in a decade, and it felt like a heavy, golden chain being forged around his heart. At 4 a.m., Dr. Eris arrived. The process was quick, a gentle swab of the child's cheek while she remained in her drug-induced sleep, and a prick of Dante's finger. The doctor worked in trembling silence, well aware of the man standing over him. How long? Dante asked. 6 hours for a preliminary match, sir, Eris whispered. I'll use the private lab in the basement. Go and stay there until you have the result. When the doctor left, Dante felt the weight of the night pressing in on him. He walked to the vanity and picked up the gold locket again. He snapped it open, staring at the photo of his younger self. He remembered the day Alina had taken that. They had been in the gardens, hidden behind the high hedges. She had laughed, a sound like silver bells, and told him he looked too serious for a boy of 18. He had loved her then. He realized with a crushing certainty that he had never stopped. He looked at the phone again, at the image of the bruised Alina. The kidnappers wanted the book. They thought they held the cards because they had the woman. They didn't realize that by hurting her, they had unleashed a version of Dante Moretti that the world wasn't prepared for. He picked up his phone and typed a reply to the unknown number. His fingers were steady now. So I have the book. And I have the girl. If there is a single new mark on her mother when I see her, I will not just kill you. I will erase your entire bloodline from history. Name the place. So, he hit send and watched the message status change to delivered. Suddenly, a small, cold hand touched his. Dante jumped, his instinct screaming to strike, but he froze when he saw Lily standing beside him. She had climbed out of bed silently, her eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears. She was still clutching the tattered, blood-stained teddy bear. Is my mama coming back? She whispered, her voice trembling. Dante knelt before her, ignoring the protest of his knees. He looked her directly in the eyes, seeing his own reflection in those dark orbs. He didn't lie to her. He didn't give her false platitudes. He spoke to her like a Morty. I am going to bring her home. Lily, do you know who I am? The girl looked at the lion ring on his finger, then back at his face. She reached out and touched the sharp line of his jaw. You're the man from the picture, she breathed. Mama said you were a king. She said you were the only one who could stop the bad men. Dante felt a lump in his throat that he struggled to swallow. He took her small hand in his thumb stroking her knuckles. She was right. I am a king, and you're a princess. And in this world, nobody hurts a Morty, and lives to tell the tale. Lily leaned forward, resting her head against his shoulder. Dante closed his eyes, the scent of rain and old vanilla from her hair filling his senses. He held her, his heart hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve. Just then, his phone buzzed. It wasn't a text. It was a live video feed link. Dante tapped it and his blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The camera was pointed at a chair. But Alina wasn't in it anymore. The chair was empty, knocked over, and the floor was covered in fresh, bright red blood. A voice came through the speaker, distorted and mocking. "The trade is off, Shadow King. We found something in the woman's pocket that changed the price. If you want to see her alive, you won't just give us the book. You'll give us the girl, or you can watch the woman die in real time. You have 10 minutes to decide." Dante looked at Lily, who was looking at the phone with growing terror. He realized then that the Romanos didn't just want the ledger. They knew the truth. They knew Lily was the key to the entire Morty fortune, and they were going to use his love to destroy him. He stood up, his face a mask of stone. He picked up the ledger and tucked it into his waistband, then reached for his holster. He looked at the girl. "Stay with Lorenzo," he commanded, his voice echoing with the power of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Don't leave this room." "Where are you going?" "Going," Lily cried out, reaching for him. Dante paused at the door, the blue light of the phone reflecting in his eyes like a demon's fire. "I'm going to end a war," he said. "And then, I'm going to bring your mother home." He slammed the door behind him, the sound echoing through the mansion like a gunshot. Downstairs, the elite units were already waiting, their weapons drawn. Dante didn't say a word as he walked toward the gun rack. He didn't need a plan. He needed a massacre. But as he reached for a rifle, his phone chimed one last time. It was a GPS coordinate, and it was a location that made his heart stop. It wasn't a warehouse. It was the very same gate where he had found Lily just hours ago. They weren't hiding. They were coming for him. 6, and they were already inside the perimeter. The alarm bells were screaming, a mechanical wail that matched the storm raging outside. The GPS coordinates on Dante's phone blinked the iron gates, the very spot where Lily had appeared just hours ago. He didn't wait for his men. He tore through the hallway, his boots thudding against the polished marble. But as he passed the nursery, a small choked sob stopped him in his tracks. Lily. He couldn't leave her alone with the perimeter breached. He ducked into the room, grabbing the girl just as Lorenzo and the elite guards took positions at the windows. "Dante, they're at the north wall. They've breached the secondary sensors," Lorenzo shouted over the comms, his voice strained. Dante ignored him for a heartbeat, his focus entirely on the trembling child in his arms. He tucked her into the reinforced panic closet hidden behind a heavy mahogany bookshelf. As he set her down, his hand brushed her small, worn sneaker. Something felt off. And something felt off. There was a strange stiffness in the sole that shouldn't have been there. He pulled the shoe off, his fingers moving with frantic precision. Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide and swimming with tears. "Mama said, for later," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "She said if I was safe, to give it to the lion." He ripped the inner lining of the shoe. A piece of parchment, thin and yellowed, fell out. It was folded into a tiny square. Dante unfolded it, and the sight of the handwriting made his breath hitch. It was the elegant, looping script of Alina Vance, the woman who had haunted his dreams and fueled his cold, calculated hatred for 5 years. "So they are coming for the heir. Protect our daughter, Dante. She is the only light I have left. I never took the money. I only took your heart, and I'm so sorry I had to break it to keep her alive." So the words were a physical blow to his chest. So a daughter, so not a mistake, not a lie. The air in the small room suddenly felt thin, as if the past were rising up to suffocate him. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and the sounds of the gunfire outside faded, replaced by the ghost of a soft, jasmine-scented laugh. He was 27 again. The library of the Morty estate was bathed in the golden, dying light of a summer afternoon. Alina was there, dusting the leather-bound books. She wasn't like the socialites his father constantly paraded in front of him. She didn't care for the Morty name or the blood-stained billions. She smelled of jasmine and old paper. He remembered the way her hand had trembled when he first touched her waist, the way she had looked at him not as the Shadow King, but as a man who was desperately lonely in a house full of monsters. "You shouldn't be here, Dante," she had whispered that night, her back pressed against the mahogany shelves. "Your father, he'll kill us both if he finds out." "Let him try," Dante had growled, his lips inches from hers. He'd given her his gold locket that night, the one with the photo of him as a teenager, the only piece of his childhood he still valued. He had promised her the world. He had promised to burn the syndicate down, just to build her a throne. But then came the night of the betrayal. Simone, his father, Marcello Moretti, had called him into the study. A safe was open, yawning like a dead man's mouth. $1 million in untraceable bonds were gone, and on the floor, purposefully left behind, was a single lace ribbon from Alina's hair. "She used you, Dante," his father had sneered, blowing thick cigar smoke into his face. "The maid is a thief. She's gone, and so is the money. She never loved the man, she only loved the vault. I told you, a Morty cannot afford the luxury of a heart." Dante had hunted for her for months. He had been a man possessed, wanting to kill her for the betrayal. He had let his heart turn to stone, becoming the ruthless, icy monster his father wanted him to be. He had assumed she had fled with a lover, or that she had been an agent for a rival family all along. Staring at the note now, the realization hit him like a freight train. His father hadn't been protecting the legacy, he had been purging a weakness. Marcello had framed her. He had driven the only woman Dante ever loved into the shadows, pregnant and alone, just to ensure his son would have no distractions from the throne. He had spent 5 years hating a woman who was actually running for her life to save his child. A heavy thud against the nursery door snapped him back to the present. The Romanos weren't just at the gate, they were in the house. Dante Lorenzo's voice cracked through the radio, frantic now. "They've bypassed the foyer. We're being pushed back. They have thermal signatures. They're heading straight for your floor." Dante looked at the note, then at Lily. The girl was the living proof of a love he had tried to bury under a mountain of corpses. He wasn't just fighting for a ledger or a title anymore. He was fighting for a second chance at a life he thought was lost forever. He stood up, the lion ring on his finger catching the flickering light of the storm. His eyes, once cold and indifferent, now burned with a terrifying, focused rage. He didn't just want to protect Lily. He wanted to tear the world apart to find Alina, and make every person who stood between them scream for mercy. "Stay quiet. Do not come out until I say your name," he whispered to Lily, kissing her forehead, a gesture he hadn't performed for anyone in a decade. He stepped out of the closet and closed the hidden door, just as the nursery's main entrance exploded inward. Wood splinters flew like shrapnel. 3 men in tactical gear stormed in, their red laser sights dancing across the walls. They didn't see a CEO. They didn't even see a mafia boss. They saw the Shadow King in his purest, most lethal form. Dante didn't use his gun initially. He moved with a speed that defied his size, slamming the first man's head into the marble fireplace with a bone-crunching thud. He caught the second man's wrist, snapping it like a dry twig, and drove a combat knife into his throat before the third could even level his rifle. The room was silent again within seconds, save for the wet gasps of the dying. As the third man fell, gurgling on his own blood, Dante reached down and grabbed him by the tactical vest, holding him up until they were eye to eye. "Who told you about the girl?" Dante hissed, his voice a low, demonic vibration that made the dying man's eyes widen in terror. The man coughed, blood spraying Dante's white dress shirt. The consigliere, he wheezed. He said, "The bloodline must be clean." He said, "The woman was a mistake. And the girl is the final piece." Dante's grip tightened, his own consigliere. Silas, the man who had been his father's right hand for 30 years. The man who had likely helped frame Alina 5 years ago. Suddenly, the monitor on the wall, the one showing the front gate, flickered. A new figure appeared on the screen, standing amidst the rain and the bodies of Dante's fallen guards. It was Silas, dressed in a tailored gray suit that looked untouched by the chaos. He was holding a scorched, familiar gold locket in one hand and a remote detonator in the other. "Dante," Silas's voice echoed through the room's high-tech speakers, smooth and mocking. "You always were too much like your mother. Soft, vulnerable. I finished what your father started 5 years ago with the woman." Now I'll finish it with the child. Look at the gate, Dante. Look at what's waiting for you. Dante's eyes locked onto the screen. Behind Silas, a black van slid into view. The doors were hauled open, and a woman was pushed out onto her knees into the mud. She was bruised, her clothes torn, but her eyes, those fierce, beautiful eyes, looked directly into the camera as if she could see him through the lens. Elena, Dante breathed, his heart stopping. But then his blood turned to ice. Tied around Elena's waist was a heavy block of C4, the red timer on the detonator blinking rapidly. 0:59, 0:58. A choice, Shadow King, Silas's voice crackled. The daughter hidden in the room with you, or the mother at the gate. The mansion is rigged with explosives, and so is she. You have 60 seconds to choose who lives to see the sunrise, your legacy or your past. Dante felt the world tilt. He looked at the hidden door where Lily was tucked away, then back at the screen where Elena stood on the precipice of death. The man who never hesitated. The man who never hesitated. The man who ruled an empire with an iron fist, felt his soul shatter into 1,000 pieces. He had 60 seconds to move, and the distance between the nursery and the gate was a lifetime away. The digital countdown on the screen burned a hellish red against the darkness of the command center. 54 seconds. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving Dante Moretti, a man who had stared down death 1,000 times, suffocating in the silence of his own empire. Silas, the man he had called uncle, the man who had served the Moretti name for 3 decades, stood on that rain-slicked screen with the cold eyes of a butcher. At the gate, Elena, the only woman who had ever made Dante's heart beat for something other than power, was a broken silhouette in the mud, wired to explode. In the nursery behind him, a 5-year-old girl with his eyes was sleeping, unaware that her world was about to end before it even began. You think you know the cost of a legacy, Dante? Silas's voice purred through the speakers, distorted by the storm. But you've never had to pay it. Your father understood. He knew that love is a parasite. It makes a king weak. Choose the past that haunts you, or the future that will replace you. 40 seconds. Dante didn't scream. He didn't roar. He became a machine. His fingers flew across the master console, his mind working with the lethal precision of a grandmaster. He keyed into the mansion's internal frequency, his voice a low, vibrating growl. Shadow Squad, Alpha and Bravo. Gate extraction. Sniper team, take the shot on the detonator hand. Do not hit the girl. Go. He didn't wait for a response. He spun on his heel, his heavy boots thudding against the polished marble floor as he sprinted toward the nursery. He didn't care about the gala downstairs, the hundreds of investors and politicians sipping vintage champagne in the grand ballroom, oblivious to the fact that the Moretti fortress had become a kill zone. He burst into the nursery, the door slamming against the wall. Lily jumped, her small frame jolting upright in the oversized bed. She clutched the tattered, blood-stained bear to her chest, her eyes wide with a terror that no 5-year-old should ever know. Dante? She whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer with words. He scooped her up, the silk of her borrowed nightgown a stark contrast to the cold tactical leather of his vest. He tucked her head into the crook of his neck, his large hand shielding her skull. Hold on to me, Lily. Close your eyes. Do not open them until I tell you. The mansion shook. A dull, heavy thud echoed from the front of the estate, the sound of a controlled breach. The timer had hit 0. Dante's heart plummeted, a cold void opening in his chest. Sow, Elena, sow, but then his earpiece crackled. Target neutralized. Detonator disabled. We have the woman. Boss, she's alive. We'll rip him down. The Romanos, they're not just at the gate. They're inside. Dante let out a breath that was half sob, half growl. She was alive. But the trap wasn't just Silas. It was a full-scale invasion. The Romano family, his oldest rivals, had used Silas to bypass the outer perimeter. But the gala wasn't a party anymore. It was a hunting ground. Dante kicked open the side door of the nursery just as the main hallway erupted in gunfire. He didn't head for the panicked crowds in the ballroom. He moved through the servant passages, the narrow veins of the house he had memorized as a lonely boy. He could hear the screams, now the high-pitched terror of the elite, as the Romano assassins discarded their disguises. There in the west wing, a voice, shouted from the shadows. Two men in waiters' jackets, suppressed submachine guns in hand, rounded the corner. Dante didn't hesitate. With Lily tucked firmly against his left side, he drew the custom Beretta from his thigh holster. Sell pop, pop, sell 2 shots, 2 forehead entries. The men dropped like puppets with their strings cut. He stepped over the bodies, his stride never breaking. He felt Lila's small hands tightening on his shirt, her face buried in his shoulder. He expected her to scream, to wail, but she was silent, a tiny statue of marble in his arms. He reached the balcony overlooking the grand ballroom. Below, the scene was chaos. Men in tactical gear were herding the wealthy guests into the center of the room. Silas stood on the grand staircase, looking down at the carnage with a smirk of satisfaction. He wasn't just a traitor, he was an architect of a new order. "Find the girl," Silas shouted over the din. "Dante won't leave her. He's a Morty. He'll die for his blood." Dante felt a surge of white-hot rage. He looked down at Lily. She had opened her eyes. She wasn't looking at the gunman or the blood. She was looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the lion ring on his finger, the gold glinting in the flickering chandelier light. She looked at the blood on his sleeve, then back at his face. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a terrifyingly calm recognition. "Are you the lion?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the shouting below. "I am the man who is going to get you out of here," Dante replied, his voice like grinding stones. He vaulted over the railing, landing on a buffet table with a crash of silver and crystal. The room went silent for a heartbeat as the Shadow King appeared in the center of the storm. The Romano hitmen turned, their weapons rising, but Dante was faster. He was a blur of violence, a man who had spent his life preparing for a war he hoped would never come. He used the environment as a shield, flipping tables, sliding across the blood-slicked floor, his gun barking a rhythmic cadence of death. He was a father now. Every bullet he fired was a vow. Every life he took was a layer of protection for the soul of the child he held. He reached the heavy oak doors of the study, kicking them shut and throwing the iron bolt just as a hail of bullets shredded the wood. He set Lily down behind a reinforced mahogany desk. "Stay here. Do not move. You're bleeding," she said, pointing to his shoulder where a graze had torn through his suit. Dante didn't even feel it. He was focused on the monitor in the corner of the room. It showed the courtyard. His shadow squad had Alina. They were moving her toward the underground bunker, but they were surrounded. Silas was moving toward the study, his footsteps heavy on the marble outside. "Dante!" Silas yelled through the door. "Give me the ledger. Give me the child, and I'll let the woman live. You can't save them both. You're just one man." Dante looked at the desk. He looked at the ledger. Lily had brought the book that contained the names of every snake in his garden. Then he looked at the lion ring on his finger. He realized then that being a king wasn't about the throne. It was about what you were willing to burn to protect your pride. He turned to Lily, kneeling so he was at her eye level. He took her small, trembling hand in his. "Lily, do you trust me?" The girl looked at the door, where the wood was splintering under the weight of an axe. She looked at the man who had been a myth to her until tonight. She didn't nod. Instead, she reached out and touched the blood on his cheek, her tiny thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "Mama said you were the bravest man in the world," she whispered. "She said you would come for us." Us. Dante's chest tightened so hard it hurt. He stood up, his gaze turning to the door with a cold, predatory light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a secondary detonator, the one for the mansion's own defensive perimeter. "I'm not just coming for you, Lily," Dante said, his voice dropping to a whisper that promised a massacre. "I'm going to make sure they never come for anyone ever again." The door groaned. The hinges screamed. As the wood gave way and Silas's face appeared through the gap, Dante didn't retreat. He stepped forward, the Shadow King fully unleashed, ready to show the world that a father with nothing to lose was the most dangerous creature on earth. But as he raised his weapon, the lights in the entire mansion suddenly died, and a new, even more terrifying sound began to echo from the vents, a sound that made even Silas freeze in his tracks. The high-pitched whine from the vents wasn't a mechanical failure. It was the sound of the Morty estate's ultimate fail-safe, a pressurized neurotoxin release designed to incapacitate anyone not wearing a specialized filtration mask. Dante's hand flew to the hidden compartment beneath his mahogany desk, pulling out two small, translucent respirators. He slammed one onto Lily's face, ignoring her muffled cry of surprise, and fitted the other over his own mouth just as a pale, odorless mist began to roll across the floorboards like a ghostly tide. Outside the door, the sound of Silas's heavy breathing turned into a series of violent, hacking coughs. The axe thudded to the floor. Through the splintered gap in the wood, Dante saw his consigliere heir's eyes bulge, his face turning a sickly shade of purple before he collapsed into the darkness of the hallway. Dante didn't wait for the mist to clear. He scooped Lily up, her small body trembling against his chest, and moved through the secret passage behind the bookshelf. His heart was a hammer against his ribs, not from fear of the gas, but from the weight of the girl in his arms. She was so light, so fragile, yet she held the power to bring his entire world to a standstill. He reached a secure medical wing in the basement, the only part of the mansion with an independent air filtration system. As the heavy steel doors hissed shut behind them, the silence felt deafening. Waiting there was Dr. Harris, a man who had stitched up Dante's bullet wounds and kept the multi secrets for 3 decades. The old doctor held a manila envelope in his weathered hands. His face was unreadable, a mask of professional neutrality that Dante found suddenly infuriating. The results, Eris, Dante growled, his voice rasping through the respirator he had yet to remove. He set Lily down on a velvet armchair, her wide eyes watching them with an intelligence that far exceeded her 5 years. Eris didn't speak. He simply handed the envelope to Dante. The paper felt like lead. For a man who had ordered executions without a second thought, Dante's fingers shook as he tore the seal. His eyes scanned the technical jargon, the graphs of alleles and genetic markers, until they landed on the bottom line. Cell probability of paternity 99%. So the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Dante's breath hitched, a sharp, jagged sound in the quiet room. He looked at the paper, then at Lily, then back at the paper. The cold, calculated Shadow King vanished, replaced by a man drowning in the realization of 1,000 sins. She was his. The child who had been shivering at his gate, the child who had been hunted through the night, was the literal flesh of his flesh. Dante, Eris whispered, his voice full of a pity that Dante normally would have responded to with violence. She has your markers, and the maternal side. It's a perfect match for the samples we kept from Alina's employment records. Dante sank into a chair, the weight of the last 5 years crashing down on him. He remembered the night Alina had vanished. He had been told she was a spy, a common thief who had seduced him to get to the Morty ledgers. He had hunted for her for months, his heart fueled by a toxic mix of love and a desire for vengeance. Eventually, his father and Silas had convinced him she was dead, killed in a botched escape. He had buried his heart that day, turning into the monster the syndicate needed him to be. She didn't betray me, Dante whispered, the words tasting like ash. She was running for her life. From me, from all of this. He looked at Lily. She was clutching the blood-stained bear again, her thumb hooked into the gold locket around her neck. Dante walked over to her, dropping to his knees. He was no longer the CEO of a billion-dollar empire, or the head of a crime family. He was a father looking at the daughter he had failed before she was even born. Lily, he said, his voice cracking. Your mother, Alina, where did she tell you to go after you reached the gate? Lily looked at him, her lip quivering. She said the lion would protect me. She said you were the only one strong enough to stop the snake from taking the book. Dante's eyes darkened. Sal the Snake. Sal, that was the nickname the lower-level soldiers used for Silas. Silas, the man who had been his father's right hand. Silas, who had been mentoring Dante since he was a boy. Dante stood up, a cold, lethal calm settling over him. He walked over to the terminal on the wall, his fingers flying across the keys as he accessed the decrypted ledger Lily had brought. He bypassed the financial records and went straight to the internal security logs from 5 years ago, files that had been locked behind his father's private encryption. Files he had never thought to question until now. As the data scrolled past, the truth began to bleed out in lines of glowing green text. Alina hadn't stolen the ledger. She had discovered a plot by Silas and Dante's own father to eliminate Dante and seize control of the Morty Industries' legal assets. They were going to frame Dante for massacre and let him rot in prison while they played kings. Elena had found out, and when she tried to warn him, Silas had intervened. The log showed a directive: so dispose of the maid. Secure the heir. If she is pregnant, the bloodline must be controlled, not lost. So Dante felt a roar of pure, unadulterated rage building in his chest. They hadn't just separated them. They had treated Elena like a broodmare for the Morty legacy. Silas hadn't kidnapped her to kill her. He had kept her as leverage, a way to ensure that if Dante ever stepped out of line, they would have a pure replacement ready to take the throne. He knew, Dante hissed, his hand slamming into the wall. Silas knew she was alive this entire time. He's been holding her in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to use her against me. He turned to his head of security, Marcus, who had just entered the room after clearing the gas from the upper floors. Marcus looked at the DNA report and then at Dante's face. He didn't need to be told. Find out where Silas was taking her, Dante commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity. I don't care how many bodies you have to pile up. I want the location of every Romano safe house, every black site Silas has touched in the last 48 hours. If a single hair on Elena's head is harmed, I will turn this city into a graveyard. Sir, Marcus hesitated. Silas has half the inner circle with him. They believe you're compromised because of the girl. If you move now, it's civil war. Dante walked over to the weapon rack, pulling out a custom made 45 and checking the chamber with a rhythmic diddly click. He looked at his daughter, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and awe. It's not a civil war, Marcus, Dante said, his eyes glowing with the fire of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. It's an extermination. He walked back to Lily and knelt one more time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy gold signet ring, the lion that represented his power. He pressed it into her small palm and closed her fingers over it. Stay with Dr. Eris, Lily. This ring, it tells everyone in this house that you are the queen. If anyone but me or Marcus tries to touch you, you show them this. Do you understand? Lily nodded solemnly, her small hand gripping the ring tightly. Are you going to get Mama? Dante leaned forward and kissed her forehead, the first tender gesture he had made in years. I'm going to bring her home. And then, I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly what happens when someone touches what belongs to a Morty. As Dante turned to leave, his coat billowing behind him like the wings of a dark omen, the monitors in the room suddenly flickered. A video feed overrode the security display. It was a grainy low-light shot of a concrete cell. In the center, tied to a chair, was a woman. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised, but her spirit was unmistakable. Elena. A voice came through the speakers, Silas's voice, distorted and mocking. You found the truth, didn't you, Dante? A bit late for a family reunion, I'm afraid. If you want her to draw another breath, you'll bring the ledger and the girl to the Pier 47 warehouse. In 1 hour, alone, or I'll show you exactly how pure I can make the Morty bloodline by ending hers. But Dante didn't scream. He didn't roar. He simply stared at the screen, his expression becoming so void of emotion that even Marcus stepped back in fear. He reached out and touched the screen where Elena's face was, his finger tracing the line of her cheek. 1 hour, Dante whispered to the empty air. He turned to Marcus, his voice a cold blade. Ready the Shadow Squad. We aren't going there to negotiate. We're going there to burn. But as they moved toward the door, a loud, metallic clatter echoed from the ventilation shaft, above them the same sound from before. But this time, it was followed by a small, electronic beep that made Dante's blood run cold. Silas hadn't just escaped. He had left a parting gift inside the very room meant to be their sanctuary. The high-pitched electronic chirp echoed through the reinforced walls of the panic room, a sound so small yet so predatory that it seemed to freeze the very air in Dante's lungs. His eyes, usually as cold and unyielding as flint, darted toward the ventilation grate. He didn't wait for Marcus to react. In one fluid, violent motion, Dante scooped Lily into his arms, shielding her small body with his own as he dove behind a heavy mahogany desk. Marcus had his weapon drawn before Dante even hit the floor, his barrel leveled at the ceiling. But there was no explosion, No burst of fire or shards of metal. Instead, a thick, sweet-smelling mist began to hiss from the vents, swirling into the room like a ghostly shroud. "Gas!" Marcus shouted, reaching for his tactical mask. Dante didn't have a mask for the girl. He ripped the silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, pressed it firmly over Lily's nose and mouth, and hissed into her ear, "Hold your breath, little lion. Do not breathe until I tell you." Lily's eyes were wide, twin pools of terror, but she didn't scream. She gripped Dante's lapels so hard her knuckles turned white. Dante held her close, the scent of her strawberry shampoo clashing with the metallic tang of the gas. He felt a surge of protective fury so primal it threatened to override his tactical mind. This was his sanctuary, his fortress, and Silas had turned it into a cage. "It's a sedative, boss," Marcus choked out, his voice muffled by his mask. "Non-lethal. They don't want us dead. They want her." Dante's jaw tightened. Silas didn't want him dead because a dead Dante Moretti would trigger a succession war that would burn the city to the ground. Silas wanted a puppet. He wanted the heir. He wanted Lily. Dante realized then that the video of Alina at the docks wasn't just a threat, it was a lure. Silas wanted Dante to rush out of the mansion, leaving the girl behind in the safety of his guards who had already been compromised. "He's still here," Dante whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The video was a loop. Silas never left the estate. Dante pulled a hidden lever beneath the desk, opening a manual override floor hatch that led to the service tunnels, a secret known only to the Moretti bloodline. He signaled Marcus to cover the door while he descended into the darkness with Lily. The tunnels were narrow, smelling of damp earth and old secrets. As they moved, Dante's mind raced. He had to flush out the traitor, and he had to do it before the sedative gas in the vents upstairs claimed the rest of his loyal men. They emerged 10 minutes later in the nursery, a room Dante had ordered prepared weeks ago in a fit of subconscious preparation he hadn't wanted to admit to. It was a fortress within a fortress, lined with lead and reinforced steel. He set Lily down on the plush rug, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of a father who had just realized his child was the ultimate prize in a blood-soaked game of chess. Lily looked up at him, her lips trembling. "Is Mama really in that chair?" she whispered, her voice small and broken. "Is she hurt because of me?" Dante knelt in front of her, his massive frame dwarfing the child. He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "No, Lily, she is hurt because men like me are greedy, but I am going to end that greed tonight. I promise you." Lily reached out and grabbed his pinky finger with her entire hand. "Do you pinky swear?" Dante paused. The Shadow King didn't make oaths. He made contracts, and he broke people who failed them. But looking into those eyes that were so much like his own, yet filled with a light he had lost decades ago, he felt the ice around his heart crack. He hooked his massive pinky around her tiny one. "I pinky swear, Lily. On my life. On the Moretti name." "Mama says a pinky swear is a magic shield," she said, a tiny spark of hope returning to her face. "It means you can't be defeated." "Then I am invincible," Dante replied, his voice a low growl of determination. He stood up and turned to the wall-mounted monitors in the nursery. He didn't call his lieutenants. Instead, he opened a private channel to the entire house staff. "This is Dante Moretti," he said, his voice echoing through every hallway, kitchen, and barracks in the estate. "The ledger Lily brought home is currently in the nursery safe. It contains the names of every man who has sold his soul to the Romanos. I am leaving the girl and the ledger to go find Alina. Any man who wishes to claim the bounty on her head, now is your time." It was a lie. A deadly, calculated lie. He wasn't leaving. He was the bait. He sat in the shadows of the nursery, a silent Beretta resting on his knee, watching the door. Lily had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the small bed, clutching the blood-stained bear. The minutes ticked by, the silence of the mansion heavy and suffocating. Then, the faint sound of a high-tech lock being bypassed whispered through the room. The door creaked open. A shadow slipped inside, moving with the practiced grace of a professional. The figure didn't head for the safe. It headed straight for the bed where Lily lay. The intruder reached out a gloved hand, a syringe filled with a clear liquid glinting in the moonlight. A bit predictable, don't you think, Silas? Dante's voice came from the darkness, cold enough to freeze blood. The figure froze. Slowly, the intruder turned, the moonlight catching the silver hair and the refined features of the man Dante had trusted since he was a boy. It wasn't a low-level soldier. It wasn't a rival family's assassin. It was Silas, the consigliere, the man who had practically raised Dante after his father's death. Dante, Silas said, his voice smooth and devoid of shame. You always were too sentimental for your own good. You should have stayed in the panic room. The gas would have been a much kinder end for you. You kidnapped Alina, Dante said, rising from the shadows like a demon ascending from hell. You told me she stole from me. You made me hate the only woman I ever loved. Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. She was a maid, Dante. A distraction. The Morty bloodline needed to be tempered with steel, not softened by a girl from the gutters. I did what your father didn't have the stomach to do. I purged the weakness. And the ledger? Dante asked, stepping into the light. The names of the traitors. My names. Silas spat, his mask of composure finally slipping. I've spent 30 years building this empire while you played at being a legitimate CEO. This girl, she's the key. With her, as my ward, and you out of the picture. The Morty Industries and the Syndicate finally belong to someone who knows how to use them. Silas moved with surprising speed for a man of his age, lunging not at Dante, but at Lily, intending to use her as a human shield. But Dante was faster. He didn't fire his gun. He didn't want the noise to wake the girl. He launched himself across the room, his fist connecting with Silas's jaw with a sickening crack of bone. They crashed into the furniture. A whirlwind of violence in the middle of the nursery. Silas pulled a hidden blade, slashing at Dante's chest, the steel biting through his expensive suit and drawing a line of crimson. Dante didn't even flinch. He grabbed Silas's wrist, twisting it until the bone snapped, the knife clattering to the floor. He pinned the older man against the wall, his hand crushed around Silas's throat. Where is she? Dante hissed, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, murderous light. Where is Alina? Silas gasped for air, a bloody grin stretching across his face. You think I'm the only one? Look at the cameras, Dante. Look at your loyal shadow squad. Dante's gaze flickered to the monitors. His heart plummeted. Outside the nursery door, Marcus and 3 other men were being surrounded by dozens of soldiers, men Dante recognized, men who had eaten at his table. They weren't fighting. They were lowering their weapons. The betrayal wasn't just Silas. It was half his army. You're a king without a kingdom, Silas wheezed, his eyes bulging. Kill me, and my men will turn this room into a tomb for you and the brat. Dante looked at the monitor, then back at Silas. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, one that made Silas's grin vanish. You forgot one thing, Silas, Dante whispered, leaning in close. I'm not just a king. I'm a CEO. And I just initiated a hostile takeover. Dante reached into his pocket and pressed a single button on a small remote. Suddenly, the mansion's lights flickered and died. Secondary alarm began to blare, not the security alarm, but the fire suppression system. But it wasn't water that began to spray from the ceilings in the hallway. It was highly flammable chemical accelerant. What have you done? Silas gasped. I've rigged my own house to burn, Dante said, his voice devoid of any emotion. And I'm the only one with the exit codes. Now tell me where Alina is, or we all go up in flames together. Just then, Lily stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open as the red emergency lights bathed the room in the color of blood. She saw her father holding a man by the throat, the room smelling of chemicals and death. She didn't cry. She saw the lion ring on the necklace Dante had given her, and she remembered the pinky swear. Daddy, she whispered. She whispered. The word hit Dante like a physical blow. It was the first time she had called him that. His grip on Silas's throat tightened, his knuckles white. He had a choice. The vengeance he had craved for 5 years, or the child who had just given him a reason to live. As the sound of footsteps thundered down the hallway, the traitors coming to claim their prize, Dante realized that the trap he had set for Silas was about to become his own execution chamber. if he didn't move now. But as he prepared to make his move, the nursery door didn't burst open. Instead, a heavy, metallic thud echoed from the other side, followed by the sound of a chainsaw cutting through the reinforced steel. Someone wasn't waiting for the codes. Someone was cutting their way in. The sparks from the chainsaw danced like dying stars against the darkened hallway, casting jagged shadows that flickered across Lily's terrified face. Dante shielded her with his body, his fingers digging into Silas's neck, ready to snap bone if the person on the other side was an enemy. With a deafening groan of protesting metal, the reinforced door buckled and crashed inward. Smoke and the acrid scent of burnt steel billowed into the room. Through the haze, a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped forward, a heavy tactical breaching tool in hand. It wasn't a Romano assassin. It was Marco, Dante's most loyal lieutenant, his face grim and splattered with the blood of the traitors he'd had to cut through to reach the inner sanctum. "Boss, the perimeter is breached, but the loyalists have held the foyer," Marco shouted over the roar of the fire suppression system. "We need to move." Now, Dante didn't waste a second. He shoved the gasping, semi-conscious Silas toward Marco. "Secure him? He's not allowed to die until I say so. He has the location." He then turned to Lily, who was trembling so violently she could barely stand. He scooped her up, feeling her small hands lock around his neck in a desperate, white-knuckled grip. "I've got you, little lion," he whispered, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to be the only thing keeping her from shattering. "I got you." They moved through the mansion like ghosts through a burning ship. Dante led them through the Secret Service tunnels, bypassing the main halls where the sounds of gunfire and shouting still echoed. He brought them to the sub-basement, a high-tech bunker that served as the nerve center for Morty Industries' Black Ops division. Once the heavy blast doors hissed shut, the chaos of the mansion faded into a heavy, clinical silence. Dante placed Lily on a leather sofa, barking orders at the standby medical team to check her for injuries. He didn't wait for a report. He strode across the room to where Silas had been dumped into a steel chair, his hands zip-tied behind him. The traitorous consigliere looked pathetic, his expensive suit ruined, his face a mask of swelling bruises. Dante didn't use a knife. He didn't use a gun. He simply leaned in, his shadow swallowing the smaller man whole. "Every minute you waste is a piece of skin I will take from you while you're still awake to feel it," Dante said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Where is she?" Silas spat blood onto Dante's polished shoes, a final, futile act of defiance. "The docks, Pier 47. The cold storage warehouse." "But you're too late, Dante. The Romanos, they've been questioning her for 3 days. They wanted the ledger codes. She's broken." The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Dante didn't flinch, but the vein in his temple throbbed with a lethal rhythm. He turned to Marco, his eyes glowing with a feral, predatory light. "Assembled a shadow squad. Full tactical gear. I want the docks leveled. If anyone breathes in that warehouse who isn't Alina, they don't leave alive." Marco nodded, already barking into his comms. The room erupted into a symphony of calculated violence, the clicking of magazines being seated into rifles, the Velcro tier of ceramic armor plates being donned, the low hum of encrypted tablets mapping out the harbor. Dante began to strip off his tailored blazer, tossing it aside like a useless skin. He pulled on a black tactical vest, checking the slide on his customized Beretta with a practiced, lethal efficiency. He was no longer the CEO who sat in glass boardrooms. He was the Shadow King, a man born of blood and forged in the dark. As he prepared to leave, he felt a small tug on his tactical belt. He looked down to see Lily. She looked tiny amidst the giants in black gear and heavy weaponry, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. She held out her hand, her palm open. "You're going to get Mama?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. Dante knelt, ignoring the ticking clock and the war at his gates. He looked at the girl who was his blood, his legacy, and his only hope for a soul. He reached for the gold chain around his neck, unhooking the heavy signet ring that bore the Morty lion, the symbol of his family's absolute power. He took her small hand and closed her fingers around the cold, heavy gold. "Listen to me, Lily. This is the lion's ring. It's a magic shield. As long as you hold it, nothing in this world can hurt you. My men will stay here, and they will guard you like you are a queen. I am going to bring your mother home. Do you believe me? Lily looked at the ring, then back at him. She took a shaky breath and nodded. Pinky swear? She whispered. Dante hooked his pinky with hers. The contrast between his scarred, large hand and her tiny one a testament to the world he was trying to protect her from. Pinky swear, he promised. He stood up, his face hardening into a mask of stone as he turned back to his men. Leave a double perimeter here. Anyone who approaches this room without my voice clearance is to be terminated on sight. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked at her again, he might not be able to do what needed to be done. He led the shadow squad out through the garage, where a fleet of black, armored-edged, wing like crouching beasts. The drive to the docks was a blur of high-speed maneuvers and hushed tactical updates. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, turning the city into a distorted landscape of neon and gray. Dante sat in the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the GPS tablet. Pier 47 was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and abandoned cranes, the perfect place for a massacre. Boss, we're 2 minutes out, Marco reported, checking his thermal optics. Heat signatures detected in the main office and the basement level of the warehouse. At least 20 hostiles. They've got snipers on the roof. Dante checked his weapon one last time. The rage he had been suppressed was now a cold, sharp blade in his chest. He thought of Alina, the girl who had loved him when he was a monster. The woman who had lived in the shadows for 5 years just to keep their daughter safe. She had endured the Romano's cruelty while he had been sitting in his ivory tower, nursing a grudge built on lies. The guilt was a poison, and the only antidote was the blood of his enemies. Take the snipers out first, Dante commanded, his voice cutting through the static of the rain. I want a silent entry on the north side. Marco, you take the basement. I'm going for the office. If she's there, I want her secured before the first grenade drops. Test IEDs cut their lights, gliding into the darkness of the industrial district like sharks in deep water. They stopped 100 yards from the warehouse, the doors opening in unison as the shadow squad spilled out, moving with the synchronized grace of professional killers. Dante moved at the head of the formation, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a desperate, agonizing need to reach her. They reached the perimeter fence. His snipers silenced shots, thudding into the distance as the Romano guards on the roof collapsed like marionettes with their strings cut. Dante breached the side door, his suppressed pistol coughing twice as he dropped the 2 guards in the hallway, before they could even raise their weapons. The air inside the warehouse smelled of salt, rotted fish, and something metallic, the unmistakable scent of fresh blood. He followed the sound of a low, rhythmic thudding coming from the floorboards below. It was a heart-wrenching sound, the sound of someone being struck, followed by a muffled, weak groan that made Dante's vision tunnel into a red haze. He signaled his men to hold the hallway and kicked open the heavy steel door to the central office. The scene inside was a nightmare. Alina was tied to a wooden chair in the center of the room, her head hanging low, her dark hair matted with blood and sweat. A man in a Romano-crested jacket stood over her, his fist raised for another blow. On the desk nearby sat the ledger Lily had carried, its pages splayed open like a dissected corpse. The man turned, surprised by the intrusion, but he never had a chance to speak. Dante fired, the bullet catching him square in the shoulder, spinning him around and pinning him against the wall. Dante didn't kill him, not yet. He wanted the man to see what was coming. Dante rushed to Alina, his hands trembling as he reached out to lift her chin. Alina, he choked out, the name a prayer and a plea. Her eyes fluttered open, bruised and swollen, struggling to focus on his face. When she finally recognized him, her first reaction wasn't relief. It was pure, unadulterated terror. She tried to shrink away from him, her voice a broken, raspy whisper that shattered Dante's heart into a million pieces. No, please, don't take her. Don't hurt Lily. Dante, please. She thought he was there to finish what the Romano started. She thought he was the monster she had been running from all those years ago, before he could comfort her. A low, distorted laugh echoed from the speakers in the corner of the room. A touching reunion, Morty. A voice boomed, the voice of the Romano patriarch. But you should have checked the floorboards. You're standing on 500 pounds of C4, and I'm holding the trigger. Say goodbye to your little maid." Dante looked down and saw the red blinking light beneath the floor joists, just as the sound of a distant detonator clicked. The click of the detonator was a sound that should have signaled the end of the world, a hollow metallic snap that echoed through the cavernous warehouse, louder than the crashing waves of the Atlantic outside. For a heartbeat, time suspended itself. Dante Moretti, the man who had built an empire on cold logic and ruthless efficiency, felt the icy grip of a fear he had never known, not for his own life, but for the broken woman trembling in the chair before him. The red light beneath the floorboards pulsed like a dying heart, faster and faster, a rhythmic countdown to oblivion. "Dante, get out." Marco's voice crackled through the comms, frantic and distorted by the interference of the Romano jamming signal. "The whole sector is rigged. You have 30 seconds. Dante didn't move toward the exit. He didn't even look at the door. His eyes were locked on Elena. She looked like a ghost, a fragile remnant of the vibrant woman who had once lit up the dark corners of his mansion. Her skin was a sickly translucent pale, mapped with the purple and blue of fresh bruises. When she looked at him, there was no recognition of a savior. There was only the raw, jagged terror of a prey animal looking at a different kind of predator. "Don't touch her," Elena gasped, her voice a dry rattle. She struggled against the thick hemp ropes cutting into her wrists, her movements weak and uncoordinated. "Take the ledger. Take everything. Just let Lily go. Please. Dante, don't kill her because of me." The words hit him harder than any bullet ever could. She thought he was there to tie up loose ends. She thought the man she had once loved, the man who was the father of her child, was capable of murdering his own blood to protect his reputation. The realization was a physical weight, crushing his lungs. He reached for his tactical knife, the blade sliding out with a lethal hiss, and Elena flinched so violently the chair nearly tipped. "I'm not here for the ledger, Elena," Dante growled, his voice thick with a suppressed roar of grief. He slashed through the ropes in 4 swift, precise strokes. As the tension snapped, Elena collapsed forward, her body failing her. Dante caught her before she hit the floor, his large, calloused hands looking monstrous against her thin frame. Outside, the docks erupted into a symphony of violence. The Shadow Squad, Dante's elite paramilitary unit, had engaged the Romano guards in a full-scale siege. The rhythmic thud of suppressed submachine guns and the shattering of industrial glass provided a chaotic backdrop to the suffocating silence between the two former lovers. "We have to go," Dante commanded, pulling her arm over his shoulder. "No!" Elena screamed, a sudden burst of adrenaline fueled by maternal instinct. She pushed against his chest, her eyes wide and wild. "You'll take her. You'll turn her into one of you." "I won't let you. I'll die before I let you have her." The red light on the floorboards turned into a solid, unblinking crimson. The high-pitched whine of the charging capacitors filled the air. They had seconds. Dante looked at the door, then back at the woman who looked at him with such profound hatred and fear. He realized in that moment that he couldn't force her. He couldn't just carry her out like a trophy. If he wanted to save her, truly save her, he had to destroy the monster she saw in his eyes. In the middle of a collapsing warehouse, surrounded by 500 pounds of C4 and an advancing army of assassins, the Shadow King did the unthinkable. He let go of her. He stepped back and let his custom-made Beretta clatter to the blood-stained concrete. He dropped to his knees, his expensive suit trousers soaking up the filth of the warehouse floor, and lowered his head. He made himself small. He made himself vulnerable. "I'm not the man you remember, Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that would have horrified his board of directors. "And I'm so goddamn sorry for the man I was. I'm sorry I let you go. I'm sorry I believed the lies. I don't want the empire. I don't want the ledger. I just want you and Lily to breathe." Elena froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She stared at the back of his neck, at the powerful man kneeling in the dirt, surrendering his pride in the face of certain death. The sheer wrongness of the sight, the line of Morty bowing to a maid, cracked the shell of her terror. For a flickering second, she saw the boy he had been before the world broke him. "Dante," she breathed, her voice small. "The girl, she's at the gates." "Elena," he said, looking up, his dark eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "She's safe. She's wearing my ring. She's waiting for her mother. Please, let me take you to her. A massive explosion rocked the northern end of the warehouse. The shockwave shattered the remaining windows, raining diamonds of glass down upon them. The floor groaned, the wooden joists splintering as the foundation began to give way. Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the scarred skin of his hand. It was the lightest of touches, but to Dante, it felt like a lightning strike. He grabbed her hand, pulled her into his arms, and stood up in one fluid motion. He didn't wait for her to speak again. He kicked through a side window just as the first of the C4 charges detonated in the basement. The world turned into fire and noise. Dante shielded Elena's body with his own as they tumbled out onto the rain-slicked pier. Behind them, the warehouse vanished in a colossal orange fireball that lit up the midnight sky for miles. The heat was a physical blow, searing the back of Dante's coat. But he didn't stop running. He sprinted through the shadows of shipping containers, his boots thudding against the metal as bullets from the retreating Romano snipers whistled past his ears. Cover him. Marco yelled from the extraction van, the sliding door flying open. The Shadow Squad unleashed a wall of lead, pinning the Romanos down as Dante reached the vehicle. He dived inside, pulling Elena into the safety of the armored interior. Go! 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 The van screeched away, tires smoking against the wet asphalt. Inside the cramped space, the air was thick with the smell of ozone, smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. Dante didn't let go of Elena. He held her against his chest, feeling the frantic, hummingbird beat of her heart. She was shivering uncontrollably, her eyes slipping shut as the exhaustion finally took hold. Is she really okay? Elena murmured, her consciousness fading. She's more than okay. Elena, Dante whispered into her hair, ignoring the concerned looks from his men. She's a Morty. She's got your heart and my temper. She's waiting for us. Elena's hand clutched his shirt, her grip surprisingly strong, even in her weakened state. He wasn't the only one. She coughed, a thin trail of blood escaping the corner of her mouth. Dante stiffened. What do you mean? The Romanos. They didn't find me on their own, she whispered, her eyes fluttering open one last time, filled with a sudden, sharp clarity. Someone inside your house. Someone who knew about the locket. They sold us out, Dante. They wanted Lily dead so the bloodline would end with you. Dante's blood turned to ice. He looked out the window at the passing city lights, his mind racing through the faces of his inner circle. His consigliere, his bodyguards, his own family. He had spent his life looking for enemies in the dark, never realizing the deadliest viper was sleeping under his own roof. As Elena slipped into unconsciousness, Dante's grip on her tightened. The rescue was over, but the war had only just begun. He had saved the mother of his child, but he had just realized that the mansion where Lily was sleeping wasn't a fortress, it was a cage. And the wolf was already inside.